Think medieval times were just dark, dirty, and full of ignorance? What if I told you most of what you know is just flat out wrong? Hey there, everyone! Welcome to tonight's journey, a trip back to the Middle Ages, but not the one you've seen in movies or heard about in cliches. Tonight, I'm going to challenge everything you think you know about the medieval world. Grab your blanket, dim the lights, and let's dive in. So, what do you picture when someone says medieval times? If you're like most people, you're probably imagining dirty, crowded streets with people covered in grime and disease, knights in shiny armor swinging swords, castles under siege, and maybe a plague wiping out half the population. You might think it was a time of utter ignorance, when everyone was superstitious, couldn't read or write, and thought the world was flat. Sounds pretty grim, right? But here's the truth bomb, most of that is total myth. The Middle Ages were anything but a simple, dark, backwards era. In fact, the real story is way more fascinating, full of contradictions, complexity, and some downright surprising achievements. First off, the Middle Ages lasted nearly 1,000 years. That's right, from roughly the 5th century all the way to the late 15th century, nearly a millennium. You can't just lump all those years together and say everything was terrible. There were huge changes, innovations, and developments across that time, and different places experienced them differently. For example, the early Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, were tough. The Roman Empire had just fallen, and Europe was in a state of political chaos. But even then, people were adapting, rebuilding, and preserving knowledge. Monasteries became centers of learning and book copying, which helped keep ancient knowledge alive when much of the world was in turmoil. Fast forward a few centuries, and you get the high and late Middle Ages, when universities were founded, like Oxford and Paris, cathedrals like Notre Dame were built, and trade expanded dramatically. People weren't just surviving, they were creating art, music, literature, and even early science. You might be surprised to learn that medieval people were quite literate in certain classes, especially the clergy and nobility. Of course, literacy wasn't universal like today, but that's not unique to the Middle Ages. Even in the early 1900s, most people worldwide were illiterate. So where did this dark, ignorant image come from? Part of it is from the Renaissance, which came after the Middle Ages. Renaissance thinkers wanted to highlight how enlightened they were compared to their predecessors, so they painted the medieval period as a dark age full of superstition and backwardness. It was a way to elevate their own culture by making the past look worse than it really was. This idea stuck in popular culture, and over time it was reinforced by writers, artists, and eventually Hollywood. Movies love to show grimy streets, plague victims coughing on the sidewalk, and ignorant peasants terrified of witches. It makes for great drama, but it's not the whole truth. Another reason this myth is so persistent is because the Middle Ages were indeed different, socially, politically, and technologically. People lived in ways that seem strange or even brutal to us now, and that can make it easier to dismiss the whole era as primitive. But difference doesn't mean stupidity or darkness. Take medicine, for example. Sure, medieval medicine seems weird and even harmful by today's standards, like bloodletting and herbal remedies, but doctors were trying to make sense of the human body with the knowledge and tools they had. Some treatments actually worked, and many of the ideas from medieval scholars influenced medicine for centuries. Or look at medieval science and philosophy. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas worked hard to combine faith and reason, exploring questions about the universe and humanity that still matter today. Universities taught subjects ranging from theology to law to astronomy. And speaking of astronomy, you might have heard the myth that medieval people believed the Earth was flat. That's another one of those myths we'll get to later, but spoiler, most educated medieval Europeans knew the Earth was round. So why does all this matter? Because how we see the Middle Ages affects how we understand our own history and culture. If we only see the Middle Ages as a dark age, we miss out on the richness and complexity of that world, and how it shaped the modern one. Also, these myths feed into a false narrative that human progress is a straight line from stupidity to enlightenment, with us, of course, standing at the top. The truth is way messier. History is full of ups and downs, regressions, and leaps forward. Think medieval people believed the earth was flat. Let's uncover one of the biggest myths about the Middle Ages. Alright, so last time we talked about how the Middle Ages weren't the total dark ages we've been led to believe. But here's another one that's pretty popular, the idea that medieval folks thought the earth was flat. You've probably heard this 100 times, maybe in cartoons, movies, or just in casual conversation. But what if I told you this is one of the biggest myths ever? Most educated people during the Middle Ages actually knew the earth was round. Shocking, right? The idea that everyone back then thought the earth was flat is mostly a modern invention. It wasn't really a medieval belief. So where did this myth come from? Believe it or not, it started in the 19th century. During this time, some writers and historians wanted to paint the Middle Ages as a super backwards period to highlight how far modern science and thinking had come. The flat earth idea became a convenient story to show that medieval people were ignorant, making the Renaissance and modern era look even smarter by comparison. But the truth goes way further back. The ancient Greeks, way before the Middle Ages, already knew the earth was a sphere. Philosophers like Pythagoras and Aristotle gave plenty of arguments about the earth's roundness, and by the Roman Empire, this was widely accepted knowledge among scholars. During the Middle Ages, especially in universities and among clergy, the spherical earth was standard knowledge. It was taught and discussed openly. For example, Thomas Aquinas, a major medieval thinker, wrote about the earth as a sphere and tried to reconcile this with Christian theology. Now, not everyone in medieval Europe was an academic, obviously. Some common folk may not have had a detailed understanding of the world's shape, but that's not surprising. Even today, not everyone is a scientist or geographer. Back then, access to education was limited, but that doesn't mean medieval people were dumb. And what about Columbus? You might have heard that he faced tons of opposition because people thought he'd sail off the edge of a flat earth. That's another myth. Columbus and most educated Europeans knew the earth was round. His real challenge was convincing people about the size of the earth and the distance to Asia, not its shape. So, why does the flat earth myth persist? It's a powerful story, simple and easy to grasp. It fits neatly into a narrative of progress. We used to be stupid, but now we're smart. It's catchy and a bit funny, but it's misleading. This myth also reflects how we like to oversimplify history. It's easier to tell stories with clear villains and heroes, the ignorant medieval peasant versus the enlightened modern scientist. But real history is much more complicated and nuanced. Recognizing this helps us respect the medieval period more for what it was, a time of learning, debate, and gradual discovery. Medieval scholars preserved ancient knowledge and added to it, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolutions that came later. So next time someone drops the medieval people thought the earth was flat line, you'll know it's just another myth we're here to bust. Continuing our journey through medieval fears and myths, let's talk about the Black Death, the greatest pandemic of its time, and how it shaped our image of the Middle Ages. As you might remember, fear of heresy, witchcraft, and demonic forces was very real in medieval Europe. And that fear wasn't unfounded. Life was fragile, and diseases were often a death sentence for most people. The deadliest of these diseases was the Black Death, the plague pandemic that wiped out, by various estimates, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. But what do we really know about the Black Death? And why has it become surrounded by so many myths and misunderstandings? First, let's understand that the Black Death was a biological catastrophe caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was carried by fleas on rats. It spread incredibly fast and left very few chances of survival for those who caught it. Medieval people, without modern knowledge of microbes and hygiene, searched for explanations in religion, astrology, and folk superstitions. They believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins or the work of evil spirits and witches. That's why panic and fear spread so rapidly, and innocent groups like Jews, alleged witches, and minorities were scapegoated and persecuted. Here's where another myth begins, that medieval people were completely helpless and did nothing to fight the disease. In reality, although medicine at the time was very limited, doctors and local communities used various methods to try to contain the plague's spread. For example, many cities introduced quarantine, a word that actually originated in this period, since ships and people arriving from infected areas had to stay isolated for 40 days, from the Italian quaranta meaning 40. This was one of the earliest organized public health measures in history. They also used various folk remedies, from burning herbs and incense to wearing amulets and saying prayers. Sure, much of this looks like superstition now, but back then it was the only help they could offer. Interestingly, the Black Death fundamentally changed medieval society's structure. The massive loss of population led to a labor shortage, giving peasants and common folk new leverage to demand better wages and conditions. The feudal system began to weaken, and ideas about individual rights and freedoms gained momentum. Despite all this tragedy, the Black Death became a catalyst for major changes that paved the way for the Renaissance in modern Europe. The Inquisition, medieval terror or a misunderstood myth? Let's uncover the truth about this terrifying ecclesiastical tribunal. When you hear this word, you probably imagine dark, damp basements, people tied to torture devices, confessions extracted through unbearable pain, and ruthless church fanatics burning heretics at the stake. This image has become ingrained in popular culture through movies, TV shows, and books. But how much of this is true? Was the Inquisition really a factory of medieval terror, as it is often described? Or are there many nuances to the story? First, it must be said that the Inquisition did exist. These were institutions created by the Catholic Church, beginning in the 12th century, to combat heresy, beliefs or practices that the Church considered dangerous or false. The Church was very concerned with preserving religious unity, especially at a time when religion was the foundation of society, politics, and identity. But here's an important point. The Inquisition was not a single monolithic machine of evil that operated the same way throughout Europe. It evolved over time, differed from region to region, and the reality was much more complex than Hollywood horror stories. There were several types of inquisitions: medieval, Spanish, Roman, and others, each with its own rules, procedures, and reputation. For example, the medieval Inquisition, which began in the 12th century, was a response to the spread of heretical movements such as the Cathars and Waldensians in France and Italy. Its goal was to identify and correct heresy, often through preaching, persuasion, and ecclesiastical courts. Now about torture. This is what most people most often associate with the Inquisition. Did the Church torture people? Yes, but it's not that simple. Torture was officially regulated, and inquisitors often had to follow legal procedures that required evidence and testimony before resorting to harsh methods. It was not arbitrary violence, as depicted in movies. Historians believe that torture was used less often than people think, and most often as a last resort to obtain confessions. Even then, the methods had to comply with strict rules. Permanent physical harm could not be inflicted. Of course, psychological terror was terrible, but it is very different from the cruel picture that is painted for us. Another big myth is the scale of executions. Popular culture likes to throw around numbers of hundreds of thousands or millions burned at the stake, but modern historians estimate the number of people executed by the Inquisition over the centuries to be in the tens of thousands. This is, of course, a tragedy, but much less than is often claimed. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, is the most well-known and is often what people think of when they hear the word Inquisition. It also had a political goal: to strengthen the power of the monarchs and unite Spain under the Catholic religion. The Inquisition hunted down Jews and Muslims who had formally converted to Christianity but allegedly secretly retained their beliefs. Despite this, even the Spanish Inquisition operated within the framework of legal procedures that gave defendants certain rights: the right to a trial, the right to examine witnesses, and the right to appeal. At the same time, the judicial system was harsh, and many innocent people suffered. Fear and intimidation were real, and the Inquisition became an instrument of pressure. Now about witches. You have probably heard that it was the Inquisition that organized mass witch hunts in Europe. This is mostly a myth. Witch hunts were mostly initiated by local courts, secular authorities, and public hysteria, sometimes even against the will of church leaders. In some cases, inquisitors condemned such persecutions as superstitious. Fear of witchcraft, magic, and the devil was widespread in medieval and early modern Europe, fueled by social conflicts, economic difficulties, and religious beliefs. Accusations of witchcraft often served as a way to resolve conflicts or find scapegoats, mostly women. This history of witches is a separate and very dark chapter, sometimes confused with the actions of the Inquisition. The Inquisition is often misunderstood because of its symbolism, religious oppression, fanaticism, and cruelty. And, frankly, it deserves criticism. But to perceive it only as evil means to ignore the complex historical context, a time when religion was inextricably linked to power, law, and social order. The Church believed that it was protecting society from chaos and spiritual decline, and although its methods were cruel, its motives were also shaped by fear and a desire for control. So, what can we learn from this story? The Inquisition was not just torture chambers and bonfires, but a socio-political institution that reflected the tensions of its time. Myths about it greatly exaggerate and simplify reality, creating a medieval black villain instead of historical truth. Knights in shining armor, heroic warriors, or Hollywood myth? Let's find out who they really were. Picking up from where we left off with the Black Death shaking the very foundations of medieval society, it's time to talk about one of the most iconic images of the Middle Ages, the knights. You know the type, armored warriors charging into battle, defending damsels, and living by a strict code of honor. But how much of that is real history, and how much is just the stuff of movies and legends? First off, knights were indeed real. They were heavily armed and mounted soldiers, often from noble families, who served as the military elite in medieval Europe. Their role was crucial in warfare for centuries, especially between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries. But the popular image of knights, all shiny metal armor, chivalrous behavior, and romantic adventures, is, to a large extent, a product of later storytelling, particularly from the Renaissance and onward. Movies and novels like King Arthur and The Lord of the Rings have shaped how we think about knights, often mixing fact with fiction. So, what was life really like for a medieval knight? First, armor. It wasn't always the gleaming, full-body plate armor you see in movies. Early knights wore chainmail, a mesh of metal rings, which was effective but heavy and offered less protection than later full-plate armor, which only became widespread in the 14th and 15th centuries. And guess what? The full suits of shining armor weren't worn all the time. They were expensive, heavy, sometimes up to 60 pounds or more, and not exactly comfortable. Knights wore them mostly in battle or tournaments, not every day. In fact, early armor was often covered with surcoats and other clothing to protect it from the elements and make it less conspicuous. The idea that knights were always noble and honorable is also a bit of a stretch. Sure, the code of chivalry, a set of ideals about honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak, was promoted by the church and nobility. But in reality, knights were often more pragmatic, focused on survival, power, and wealth. Battles were brutal, and loyalty could be flexible, especially in times of political chaos. Many knights fought for pay or land, not necessarily for lofty ideals. They could be ruthless on the battlefield, and some were notorious for pillaging and violence. The romanticized idea of knights as paragons of virtue often overlooks the harsh realities of medieval warfare and politics. What about the famous knight saving the damsel in distress trope? While knights sometimes protected local communities or fought in religious wars like the Crusades, the reality was far less glamorous. Most medieval women didn't need saving, and life for ordinary people was often harsh regardless of who was fighting around them. And the tournaments? These were real, and they were a big part of knightly culture. But they were more like competitive sports than heroic quests. Knights competed in jousting and melee battles, which were dangerous and could be deadly, but also opportunities to show skill and win prizes or status. Interestingly, many knights were also literate and cultured. Some wrote poetry, music, or chronicles of their deeds. The medieval courtly love tradition, which influenced the chivalry code, came from troubadours and poets who idealized knights in romance. But this was more literary fantasy than everyday reality. So why does the myth of the noble knight persist? Partly because it's a powerful and appealing story, a symbol of bravery, honor, and adventure. It also served political and cultural purposes in later centuries, as monarchs and nations used the idea of knights to promote values like loyalty and patriotism. Understanding who knights really were, complex, often contradictory figures shaped by their time, helps us see the Middle Ages as a dynamic period, not just a fairy tale or a dark nightmare. Witches and witch hunts, terrifying reality or misunderstood panic? Let's dive into the truth behind one of medieval Europe's darkest chapters. Continuing from our exploration of knights and their world, it's impossible to ignore another haunting image of the Middle Ages, the witch hunts. We've all heard the stories: women accused of dark magic, dragged to trials, tortured, and burned at the stake. It's a grim, chilling picture, often used to symbolize the dangers of superstition and fanaticism. But how accurate is this picture? First, it's important to know that the major wave of witch hunts didn't actually take place during the core medieval period. Most of the infamous witch trials occurred in the late 15th to 17th centuries, what historians call the early modern period, just after the Middle Ages. However, the roots of witch hunting fear were definitely present in medieval Europe, and the mindset that made it possible took hold during those centuries. So where did the fear of witches come from? Medieval society was deeply religious and saw the world as a battleground between good and evil, God and the devil. Anything unexplained or threatening was often blamed on malevolent supernatural forces. Natural disasters, crop failures, diseases, or personal misfortunes could easily be interpreted as the work of witches or demons. Church teachings also played a role, as the clergy warned against heresy and magic. They believed witches made pacts with the devil, undermining the Christian order. This fear was not just about superstition but was intertwined with real social, political, and religious tensions. Who were the accused witches? Mostly women, often those who were marginalized, widows, healers, midwives, or simply outspoken individuals who didn't fit into the social norms. Accusations of witchcraft were sometimes used to settle personal grudges, target outsiders, or scapegoat the vulnerable during difficult times. The trials themselves were brutal and unfair by today's standards. Accused individuals were often tortured to extract confessions, which were then used as evidence against them. Sadly, many innocent people suffered and died in this hysteria. But it's important to understand that witch hunts were not a unified, centrally organized effort like the Inquisition. They were often driven by local authorities, communities, and courts, sometimes with tacit approval from church officials, sometimes without. The peak of witch hunts and executions came after the medieval period, fueled by a complex mix of religious upheaval, social stress, and changing political landscapes. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, was a key text that promoted witch hunting, but it came well after the medieval era. Why does the fear of witches continue to capture our imagination? Because it taps into very deep anxieties about the unknown, control, and the other. The stories of witch hunts warn us about the dangers of mass hysteria, scapegoating, and how fear can destroy communities. Looking back at medieval and early modern witch hunts reminds us that history is full of dark lessons, but also that people have struggled throughout time to understand and control the world around them. Medieval women, powerless victims or influential players? Let's uncover the real role of women in the Middle Ages. Picking up from our discussion about witch hunts and the harsh realities medieval women faced, it's important to step back and look at the bigger picture. The common stereotype paints medieval women as powerless, oppressed, confined to dark kitchens and church pews, living under the thumb of their fathers or husbands. But the reality? Far more complex and nuanced. Yes, medieval society was overwhelmingly patriarchal. Men held most of the official power: kings, lords, church leaders, and judges. Women were often legally subordinate to fathers, husbands, or male relatives. Yet, within this system, women's lives and roles varied dramatically depending on their class, location, and the era. Let's start with noblewomen. Life for a medieval noblewoman was often a mix of privilege and restriction. On one hand, they were pawns in political alliances, married off to strengthen ties between families or kingdoms. But on the other hand, noble women managed vast estates, oversaw servants, and could exercise significant authority, especially when their husbands were away at war or dead. Some even ruled as regents, governing in place of their underage sons. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. She was queen of both France and England, led armies, and played a huge role in shaping the politics of her time. Another example is Isabella of Castile, whose marriage helped unify Spain and who sponsored Columbus's famous voyage. These women weren't just passive figures, they wielded real power and influence. What about women outside the nobility? Peasant women worked incredibly hard. They labored alongside men in the fields, tended animals, processed food, and managed households. Their labor was crucial for survival, and although their lives were tough, they held a vital place in the rural economy and community. In towns and cities, women's roles diversified. Many worked as artisans, shopkeepers, or in service trades. Some guilds, The medieval version of professional associations admitted women, especially widows who took over their late husband's businesses. Women could own property, run shops, and contribute economically, even if they faced legal and social restrictions. Religion was another sphere where women could exert influence. Convents were more than just places of prayer, they were centers of learning, healthcare, and even political power. Some women became abbesses, running large religious communities and managing land and wealth. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was famous for her writings on theology, medicine, and music, a rare example of female intellectual authority in medieval Europe. But we can't ignore the limits women faced. Laws and customs often restricted their rights to own property, inherit land, or make legal decisions without male guardianship. Marriage laws typically favored men, and women's legal status was generally defined by their relationship to a father or husband. Religious and cultural attitudes often portrayed women as morally weaker and more susceptible to temptation, which helped fuel social fears and misogyny. These views were especially dangerous during the witch hunts, when women accused of magic were brutally persecuted. Despite these barriers, medieval women were far from powerless. They found ways to navigate their world, influence their families, manage estates, and sometimes wield political or spiritual power. Their contributions may have been overlooked or minimized in traditional histories, but their resilience and agency were real. Understanding the varied roles of medieval women helps us see beyond simple stereotypes. It reveals a society full of complexity, where women's experiences were as diverse as the times and places they lived in. It also reminds us that history isn't just the story of kings and battles, it's the story of people, families, and communities. Medieval roads and robbers, dangerous wildlands or misunderstood highways. Let's uncover the truth behind the myths of highwaymen and bandits. Picking up from our last discussion about the real lives of medieval women, let's now turn our attention to another enduring image of the Middle Ages, the notion that traveling the roads was a perilous adventure filled with lurking bandits ready to rob anyone unlucky enough to be on their path. This idea of ruthless highwaymen jumping out from the shadows to seize valuables and terrorize travelers is deeply rooted in popular culture, but how accurate is it? Travel in the Middle Ages was, without a doubt, very different from what we're used to today. Roads were rough, muddy, and often poorly maintained. The conditions could be harsh, especially during bad weather or in remote areas, making any journey slow, tiring, and sometimes downright dangerous. But while dangers did exist, the popular image of medieval roads as lawless wildlands swarming with thieves is exaggerated. Banditry was a real problem, but it was far from being an everyday occurrence on every road. Most main routes, especially those connecting major towns and trade centers, were reasonably safe and often patrolled by local authorities or private guards employed by nobles. Merchants traveled in caravans or with armed escorts to protect their goods. Towns and cities employed watchmen or constables who helped keep order on the roads near urban centers. The risk of encountering a bandit was higher on less traveled rural roads, especially at night or in isolated forests and borderlands where the reach of law enforcement was weaker. Yet, many travelers took precautions to minimize these risks. They traveled in groups, planned their routes carefully, and used established inns and way stations for rest and information. The romantic notion of the noble highwayman, a thief with a code of honor who steals from the rich and gives to the poor, is mostly a later invention, popularized in literature and folklore centuries after the medieval period. Figures like Robin Hood, who supposedly roamed Sherwood Forest, became symbols of resistance against corruption and tyranny, but historical evidence for their actual existence is scant. Real bandits were criminals, feared and hunted by local authorities, often preying on the vulnerable rather than embodying chivalry. That said, the stories and legends of outlaws reflect real social tensions in medieval Europe. Law enforcement was limited, especially in remote areas or border regions where feuds, clan loyalties, and political conflicts made maintaining order difficult. Lords and kings could rarely control every part of their domains, which allowed banditry and violence to flourish at times. Economic hardship and political instability also played a role. When crops failed or taxes rose, some desperate people turned to robbery as a means of survival. Banditry was as much a symptom of broader social problems as it was a criminal activity. Travelers were well aware of the risks and often relied on networks of support to stay safe. Pilgrims, merchants, and nobles would gather into groups, sometimes with armed escorts. Inns and monasteries along major routes offered shelter and advice about road conditions and dangers. The church even issued protections for pilgrims, recognizing the perils they faced and offering spiritual and practical aid. It's also important to note that medieval societies were not uniformly violent or chaotic. Many towns and regions had functioning legal systems, and people valued peace and order. Disrupting trade or travel was against everyone's interests, so there was a collective effort, even if imperfect, to keep roads passable and relatively safe. Understanding the realities of medieval travel and the social structures that supported it gives us a clearer picture of the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a dark, dangerous wilderness but a complex world where people navigated risks and uncertainties with courage and community. This nuanced view helps debunk simplistic myths and reminds us that history is often more complicated than the stories we're told. The Middle Ages had dangers, yes, but also laws, protections, and networks that helped people move through their world. Did dragons really roam the Middle Ages? Separating fiery myths from medieval realities. Picking up where we left off, after exploring the dangers of medieval roads and the reality of bandits, it's time to dive into one of the most enduring and exciting medieval legends, dragons. Those mighty beasts breathing fire, guarding treasure hoards, and terrorizing villages. But did dragons truly exist in the Middle Ages, or were they something else entirely? First, it's important to say right away, no, dragons as fire-breathing, winged monsters roaming Europe's forests didn't literally exist. No bones or records confirm their real presence. But the idea of dragons was very much alive and powerful in medieval culture, symbolizing forces far beyond simple monsters. Dragons in medieval Europe served as potent symbols in stories, art, and religion. They represented chaos, evil, and the unknown, those terrifying forces that heroes and saints needed to conquer. In many Christian tales, dragons personified Satan or sin, and slaying a dragon was like defeating evil itself. The famous tale of St. George and the Dragon is a perfect example. St. George, a knight and Christian martyr, is said to have saved a town by slaying a terrible dragon. This story wasn't just about a monster, it was an allegory about faith, courage, and the victory of good over evil. Where did these ideas come from? Medieval dragons had roots in ancient myths from various cultures. The Greeks, Romans, and even earlier civilizations told stories of serpents and giant reptiles. Sometimes, fossilized bones of dinosaurs or large prehistoric animals were found and misunderstood as dragon remains. Dragons also embodied medieval fears about the wild and the unexplored. The forests and mountains beyond towns were mysterious and dangerous places, full of wild beasts and unknown threats. Dragons captured this fear. They were the ultimate predators of the unknown, lurking beyond the edge of civilization. Medieval bestiaries, illustrated books describing real and mythical creatures, included dragons with vivid descriptions and moral lessons. They warned readers about pride, greed, and temptation, using the dragon as a cautionary symbol. But dragons weren't always evil in every culture. While European dragons often symbolize destruction and sin, dragons in Eastern cultures like China were revered as wise, powerful, and benevolent creatures. This contrast shows how dragons took on different meanings depending on culture and context. Despite never existing as real animals, dragons influenced medieval art, literature, and even family heraldry. Noble families adopted dragon images on shields and banners to symbolize strength, power, and protection. The dragon was a versatile symbol, terrifying but respected. The fascination with dragons didn't end with the Middle Ages. Dragons continued to fire the imagination in Renaissance art, romantic literature, and modern fantasy, from Tolkien's dragons in The Hobbit to dragons in Game of Thrones. These legends remind us how powerful storytelling is, shaping perceptions across centuries. So, while dragons weren't real beasts terrorizing medieval Europe, their legacy is very real, embedded in the culture, fears, and hopes of people trying to understand the world around them. The truth about medieval castles, fortresses of fear or centers of life and culture. Continuing from our exploration of dragons and myths, let's turn to one of the most iconic symbols of the Middle Ages, castles. When you think of medieval castles, you probably picture towering stone walls, drawbridges, moats, and knights standing guard. Movies and books often show castles as gloomy, fearsome fortresses full of dark dungeons and cruel lords. But is that the whole story? Castles were indeed military structures, designed to protect lands and people from enemies. But they were also much more than just fortresses. Castles served as administrative centers, homes for nobles and their families, hubs of local economy, and sometimes even cultural centers. Building a castle was a massive undertaking that required resources, skilled labor, and time. Castles evolved over the centuries, adapting to new military technologies and political realities. Early castles were simple wooden motte and bailey designs, while later castles featured thick stone walls, towers, and elaborate defenses. Inside, castles could be surprisingly comfortable and lively. Noble families lived there, hosting feasts, celebrations, and diplomatic meetings. Castles had kitchens, chapels, halls, and private chambers. They were a symbol of power but also a home, a place where daily life unfolded amid the threats outside. Many castles were also centers of justice and governance. Lords held court in their castles, settling disputes and managing their lands. Castles were often the administrative heart of a lordship, overseeing agriculture, trade, and taxation. The image of the cruel, tyrannical lord locking prisoners in dungeons comes from some historical realities but also from exaggerations. While punishments could be harsh, and some lords abused their power, many castles were part of functioning social and political systems. Castles were not isolated fortresses cut off from the world. They connected to surrounding villages and towns, acting as hubs for commerce and communication. The life around a castle could be bustling, with markets, craftsmen, and farmers all tied to the lord's domain. The castle's role changed over time. As firearms and new military tactics emerged, castles became less effective as purely defensive structures. Many were transformed into palaces or abandoned. But their symbolism as icons of medieval power and culture remains strong. Understanding the real function and life of castles helps us move beyond cliches and appreciate the Middle Ages as a time of complexity, where fear and culture, war and daily life intertwined. Medieval medicine, barbaric superstition, or foundation of modern healing? Continuing from our look inside castles and the life they hosted, let's turn our attention to a topic that often gets a bad rap: medieval medicine. When you think of medicine in the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Bloodletting, leeches, potions brewed by shadowy figures, and doctors more likely to harm than heal? It's a common stereotype, but is it the whole truth? Medicine in the Middle Ages was a complex mix of ancient knowledge, religious belief, and trial and error practice. While many treatments seem strange or even dangerous today, medieval physicians were often learned men who studied classical texts and tried to apply reason to their craft. The roots of medieval medicine lay heavily in the works of ancient Greek and Roman doctors like Hippocrates and Galen. Their theories about the balance of bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, dominated medical thinking for centuries. Illness was seen as an imbalance that needed correction, often through methods like bloodletting or purging. Universities founded in the 12th and 13th centuries, such as those in Salerno and Montpellier, became centers for medical education. Physicians studied anatomy, pharmacology, and surgery, often translating and commenting on classical works. However, medicine was also intertwined with religion. Disease was frequently seen as punishment from God, and healing involved prayer and rituals alongside physical treatments. Monasteries often provided care, and many hospitals were run by religious orders. Some medieval treatments did have real benefits. Herbal remedies, hygiene practices, and surgeries were practiced, though not always with modern understanding. The use of herbs like willow bark, which contains the active ingredient in aspirin, shows how observation played a role. Surgery was risky and painful but sometimes necessary. Medieval surgeons performed amputations, trepanations, drilling into the skull, and other procedures, often learning from battlefield injuries. The Black Death exposed the limits of medieval medicine, but it also spurred new inquiries in public health measures, like quarantines. It's true that superstition and misconceptions were widespread, but medieval medicine laid important groundwork for future advances. It was a stepping stone between ancient knowledge and the scientific breakthroughs of the Renaissance and beyond. Understanding this helps us see medieval medicine not as pure ignorance but as a human effort to understand and fight disease with the tools and knowledge available. Medieval education. Was the Middle Ages really a time of ignorance? Picking up from our last talk about medieval medicine, let's dive into another common misconception, that the Middle Ages were simply a time when nobody knew anything and learning was lost. This idea, often called the Dark Ages myth, suggests that after the fall of Rome, Europe sank into ignorance until the Renaissance rediscovered knowledge. But was medieval education really that bleak? In reality, education during the Middle Ages was alive and evolving, although it looked very different from today's system. It was primarily controlled by the Church, which ran most of the schools and universities. Monasteries were centers of learning, where monks copied manuscripts, preserved ancient texts, and taught reading, writing, and theology. The rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, marked a major development in medieval education. These institutions offered formal curricula in theology, law, medicine, and the arts, attracting students from across Europe. Scholars debated, wrote, and taught about philosophy, science, and the natural world. Figures like Thomas Aquinas worked to reconcile faith and reason, laying foundations for later scientific thought. Literacy rates were low compared to today but improving. Nobles, clergy, and some townspeople could read and write, especially in Latin, which was the language of scholarship in the church. Education was mostly for elites, but it was a vital engine for preserving and expanding knowledge. Many ancient Greek and Roman works survived through medieval manuscripts, thanks to the efforts of monastic scribes. So, while medieval education wasn't universal or modern, it was far from dead. It was a dynamic period that bridged the ancient world and the early modern era. Medieval superstition, was it all blind faith or something more complex? Following our discussion on medieval education, let's now explore superstition, a word often thrown around to describe medieval beliefs and practices. It's easy to dismiss medieval people as blindly superstitious, but their relationship with the supernatural was far more nuanced and tied deeply into their worldview. In the Middle Ages, the lines between religion, magic, and daily life were blurry. People saw the world as full of unseen forces, angels and demons, saints and spirits, that interacted with the material world. Prayers, charms, relics, and rituals weren't just superstition but ways to connect with the divine and influence fate. Some practices we'd call superstition today, like carrying amulets or consulting astrology, were widely accepted and often supported by clergy. Astrology, for example, was a respected field tied to medicine and philosophy. That said, the Church was also cautious, condemning what it saw as dangerous or heretical magic, which could lead to accusations of witchcraft or sorcery. This tension shaped much of the medieval experience with the supernatural. Folk beliefs and customs varied widely by region and culture, mixing Christian and pre-Christian traditions. Festivals, healing rituals, and local legends all blended into a rich tapestry of belief that gave people comfort and community. Understanding medieval superstition helps us see their world not as ignorant but as deeply spiritual, where faith and fear mingled with everyday life. Medieval festivals and celebrations, more than just dark times? Discover the joy behind the myths. Picking up from our discussion about medieval superstition and beliefs, it's time to shed light on a side of the Middle Ages that often gets overshadowed: festivals and celebrations. When you think of the Middle Ages, images of gloom, plague, and war might dominate. But medieval people also knew how to throw a party, and their festivals were vibrant, communal, and deeply meaningful. Medieval festivals were closely tied to the religious calendar, with major holidays like Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost bringing communities together. But beyond these, there were countless local feasts, fairs, and celebrations marking seasons, saints' days, harvests, and historical events. These festivals were not just about fun, they served important social functions. They reinforced community bonds, allowed for the expression of local identity, and provided relief from the hardships of daily life. Music, dancing, food, and theatrical performances were central to these occasions. One of the most famous medieval festivals was the Feast of Fools, a wild and often irreverent celebration where normal social roles were inverted. Clergy might be mocked, and common folk took on playful roles of power, reminding everyone that order could be temporarily suspended. Carnivals and mystery plays were also popular. Mystery plays dramatized biblical stories and were performed in town squares, blending entertainment with religious teaching. Feasts at castles and courts were grand affairs showcasing wealth and power. Nobles used these events to display their status, entertain guests, and conduct politics behind the scenes. Despite their religious roots, many medieval festivals had elements that would later be seen as pagan or folk traditions, reflecting the layers of culture that coexisted in medieval Europe. Understanding these celebrations helps us see the Middle Ages as a vibrant, living culture, full of joy, creativity, and resilience, not just darkness and despair. Medieval food and feasting. Beyond bread and stew, what did people really eat? When we think about food in the Middle Ages, a lot of images come to mind: stale bread, watery soup, maybe a piece of cheese or a tankard of ale. Popular culture loves to paint the medieval diet as bland and monotonous, feeding on whatever they could scrape together. But the reality was far richer and more varied. Let's start by looking at the difference between what the peasants ate and what the nobles enjoyed at their tables. Social class was the biggest factor shaping diet. For peasants, the vast majority of the population, food was all about survival and practicality. Their diet relied heavily on grains, mainly rye, barley, oats, and sometimes wheat if they could afford it. Bread was a staple, but it wasn't the fluffy white loaf we know today. Peasant bread was often coarse, dense, made from a mix of grains and sometimes with added bran. This kind of bread provided the bulk of their calories and energy. Alongside bread, peasants ate pottage, a thick stew made by boiling vegetables, legumes like peas and beans, and occasionally bits of meat or fish when available. Pottage was versatile. It changed with the seasons and what was on hand. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and onions were common ingredients. Meat for peasants was rare and mostly reserved for special occasions, like festivals or holidays. Chickens and rabbits were common sources of meat, as were game animals when hunting was possible. Fish was more accessible, especially for those living near rivers, lakes, or the coast. During religious fasting periods, fish became an important alternative to meat, since the church prohibited eating flesh. Dairy products like milk, cheese, and butter were also part of the peasant diet, although availability depended on the region and the season. Cheese was a crucial protein source, and many types of cheese were made in medieval Europe, ranging from fresh to aged varieties. Now, let's contrast that with the diet of the nobility. For the wealthy, food was a statement of power, wealth, and refinement. Nobles had access to a wide range of meats: beef, pork, venison, wild birds like pheasants and swans, and even exotic delicacies imported through trade. Feasts at noble courts were extravagant affairs with multiple courses and lavish presentations. Food was often heavily spiced, not only for flavor but to display the rarity and expense of imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and saffron. These spices traveled long distances from Asia and were symbols of status and prestige. Cooking techniques were sophisticated. Medieval cooks prepared pies filled with meats and fruits, made sauces thickened with almonds or breadcrumbs, and combined sweet and savory flavors in ways that might surprise modern palates. Honey was the primary sweetener before sugar became more widespread. Banquets weren't just about eating, they were social and political events, showcasing a lord's wealth and influence. Entertainment such as music, dancing, and performances often accompanied the meal, turning feasting into a grand spectacle. Medieval cooks also knew how to preserve food. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were common methods to keep meat and fish edible through the winter months. These preservation techniques were vital in a time before refrigeration. Drinks in medieval Europe varied by class as well. Ale and beer were staples for all social levels and often safer to drink than water. Wine was primarily consumed by the wealthy, but in regions like France and Italy, it was more common across classes. Mead, cider, and herbal infusions were also popular depending on local traditions. The church heavily influenced medieval eating habits. Fasting days and periods like Lent shaped diets, often requiring abstinence from meat or dairy. These religious regulations affected not only what people ate but also social customs around food and feasting. Food was more than mere sustenance, it was deeply woven into the social, religious, and cultural fabric of medieval life. It defined class boundaries, marked celebrations and rituals, and reflected the connections between Europe and the wider world through trade. International trade brought new foods and spices, linking Europe to Asia and Africa and gradually expanding culinary horizons. The medieval diet, then, was a complex mix of local staples, religious rules, and exotic influences. Understanding medieval food helps us see the Middle Ages not as a dull, monotonous time but as a world full of tastes, traditions, and social meanings. Medieval people, despite hardships, valued good food and celebration, just like us. Medieval justice, brutal chaos, or a system striving for order. Picking up from our deep dive into medieval food and feasting, now let's explore a topic often shrouded in fear and misunderstanding: medieval justice. When you think of medieval courts, images of dark dungeons, torture chambers, and unfair trials probably come to mind. Movies and popular stories love to show brutal punishments and ruthless inquisitors sentencing innocent people. But was medieval justice really a chaotic nightmare, or was it a complex system trying to maintain order in a difficult world? First, it's crucial to understand that medieval justice was not a single, unified system. Instead, it was a patchwork of local customs, manorial courts, royal laws, and church tribunals, all layered together across centuries and regions. Europe was divided into many kingdoms, duchies, counties, and manors, each with its own laws and legal traditions. What was true in one village might be very different just a few miles away. At the heart of medieval justice was the goal of maintaining social order. The Middle Ages were a time of hierarchical societies, with kings, nobles, clergy, and peasants all playing defined roles. Courts existed to regulate behavior, settle disputes, and punish crimes, but their methods reflected the values and beliefs of their time, which often clash with our modern ideas of fairness and human rights. Manorial courts, held by local lords, dealt with most daily disputes among peasants, things like land boundaries, debts, theft, and breaches of local customs. These courts were usually informal and relied heavily on local knowledge and community participation. The lord acted as judge and jury, but fairness was important to keep peace and loyalty. Higher courts, controlled by kings or nobles, handled more serious crimes like murder, treason, or robbery. These courts followed more formal procedures, and the accused had certain rights, like presenting witnesses. Over time, royal justice expanded to replace some local courts, creating a more centralized legal system. The church had its own courts too, which focused on spiritual offenses, heresy, blasphemy, adultery, and moral crimes. Church courts emphasized confession, penance, and forgiveness, although they also imposed harsh penalties when they saw fit. The Inquisition, often demonized, was just one part of this ecclesiastical legal system, which operated with some degree of legal procedure and oversight. One distinctive feature of medieval justice was the use of ordeals in trials by combat. Ordeals included tests like carrying a hot iron, plunging hands into boiling water, or being submerged in water. The belief was that God would protect the innocent, so if a person's wounds healed cleanly, it was a sign of innocence. Trials by combat allowed two parties to fight, with the winner considered to have divine favor. While this sounds barbaric today, it was rooted in medieval ideas about divine justice. Punishments in medieval times ranged from fines and public shaming to imprisonment, corporal punishment, and death. Public punishments such as stocks, whipping posts, and pillories were common, serving both to punish offenders and to warn the community. Execution methods varied: hanging, beheading, burning, often depending on the crime and social status of the condemned. Despite the harshness, medieval justice was also constrained by laws and customs. Arbitrary cruelty could undermine a lord's authority, so courts often had rules to ensure some measure of consistency. The Magna Carta of 1215 in England was a landmark document asserting rights like due process and protection from unlawful imprisonment, influencing the development of legal systems worldwide. Medieval judges, sheriffs, and juries played important roles. Juries, groups of local men who judged facts, began to appear in the 12th century, marking a shift towards collective decision-making. Written records of trials started to be kept more regularly, contributing to more transparency and legal precedent. The Church's role in justice also brought moral guidance and appeals to mercy. Clergy sometimes intervened to temper punishments or to provide spiritual counsel to the condemned. The idea of penance, confession, and redemption was central to medieval thought about crime and justice. All this shows medieval justice was neither pure chaos nor perfect fairness. It was a system rooted in the social and religious context of the time, struggling to maintain order amid political instability, warfare, and cultural change. Understanding medieval justice and its complexity helps us move beyond stereotypes and appreciate how people tried to live together under challenging circumstances. Medieval religion, faith, power, and the fabric of everyday life. Continuing our journey through medieval society, it's impossible to overlook the central role that religion played. Often called the Age of Faith, the Middle Ages were a time when religion wasn't just a part of life, it was the framework around which everything else revolved. But to reduce medieval religion to simple blind faith would be a mistake. The reality was far richer, more complex, and deeply intertwined with power, culture, and personal experience. Christianity, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, was the dominant force shaping medieval Europe. From the smallest village chapel to the grandest cathedral in a capital city, the church was everywhere, a powerful institution influencing politics, education, art, law, and daily routines. Most people attended Mass regularly, observed a strict religious calendar full of feast days and fasts, and lived their lives according to church teachings. The church shaped ideas about morality, sin, salvation, and the afterlife. Life was viewed through a spiritual lens, with the promise of heaven or the threat of hell guiding behavior. The clergy, priests, monks, bishops, and popes held significant authority. Monasteries were not only religious centers but hubs of learning and preservation of knowledge. Monks copied ancient manuscripts, maintained libraries, and offered charity and medical care to their communities. Religious architecture was both a sign of faith and a symbol of community identity. Gothic cathedrals, with their soaring spires and intricate stained glass, inspired awe and devotion, reflecting the church's power and the skill of medieval craftsmen. The church also wielded political power. The Pope, as spiritual leader, could influence kings and emperors, crowning them or challenging their authority. The relationship between church and state was complex, marked by cooperation and conflict, such as during the investiture controversy. Religion fueled major historical events like the Crusades, military campaigns with the stated goal of reclaiming holy lands, but also deeply entwined with political and economic ambitions. Pilgrimages were another key aspect of religious life, with millions journeying to sacred sites, seeking forgiveness, healing, or spiritual fulfillment. For ordinary people, religion was deeply personal as well as communal. Daily prayers, confession, and participation in the sacraments structured life. Saints were venerated as intercessors with God, and their relics were objects of great devotion and pilgrimage. Miracles, visions, and mystical experiences were widely accepted and recorded. However, medieval religion also had its darker sides. The Church's power sometimes manifested in intolerance and persecution. Heretics, Jews, and other religious minorities faced suspicion, discrimination, and violence. The Inquisition sought to root out heresy with harsh methods. Superstition mixed with official doctrine, creating a complex spiritual landscape. People believed in magic, demons, and protective charms alongside formal prayers and rituals. This blending of belief systems reflected the challenges of understanding the world in an age before scientific explanations. Religious festivals and rituals were major social events, blending faith with community celebration. They marked the rhythms of the year and provided relief from everyday hardships. In many ways, medieval religion was the glue holding society together, a shared set of beliefs and practices that gave meaning and order to life. It shaped identity, governed behavior, and influenced culture at every level. Understanding medieval religion as a living, dynamic force helps us move beyond stereotypes of superstition and oppression. It reveals a world where faith was intertwined with hope, fear, power, and human experience. The medieval mind, how people understood their world and themselves. Building on our deep dive into medieval religion, it's time to explore the medieval mindset, how people in the Middle Ages understood the world around them and their place within it. To us, their worldview might seem strange or outdated, but for them, It was a coherent and meaningful way to make sense of life's mysteries and challenges. Medieval people lived in a world shaped by a powerful belief in divine order. God was seen as the ultimate creator and ruler of the universe, and everything that existed had a purpose within this grand design. The cosmos was structured hierarchically, angels and saints at the top, humans in the middle, animals and plants below, and minerals at the bottom. This great chain of being was central to how people understood their place in the universe. Knowledge came from a mix of sources: religious texts like the Bible, the writings of ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, and observation of the natural world. The Church played a huge role in preserving and interpreting knowledge, framing it within Christian theology. Education was limited, mostly to clergy and the nobility, but universities flourished during the High Middle Ages, sparking intellectual debate. One of the key projects of medieval thinkers was to reconcile faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas, a leading medieval philosopher, argued that reason and revelation were not opposed but complementary. This effort shaped the intellectual life of the period and laid groundwork for later scientific progress. Medieval people interpreted natural phenomena not just through observation but through spiritual and symbolic lenses. The cycles of the seasons reflected spiritual rhythms, diseases could be punishments for sin, and miracles were everyday evidence of the divine interacting with the world. Magic and superstition were woven into everyday life, despite church condemnations. Amulets, charms, and astrology coexisted with prayers and sacraments. This mixture shows how medieval people sought control and meaning in a world often marked by uncertainty and danger. The arts were a powerful tool for conveying ideas. Paintings, sculptures, and literature often used symbolism and allegory to teach moral lessons and express theological truths. Epic tales, saints' lives, and religious dramas connected communities to their faith and shared values. Despite lacking modern scientific tools, medieval people were curious and eager to understand. Their worldview might seem foreign now, but it was a sophisticated attempt to explain existence, morality, and the cosmos. By exploring the medieval mind, we gain empathy and a deeper understanding of a culture that shaped the foundations of the modern world, a reminder that human curiosity and the search for meaning are timeless. The legacy of the Middle Ages: why medieval myths still shape our world today. As we reach the conclusion of our long journey through the Middle Ages, it's time to reflect deeply on the legacy of this period. Often dismissed as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages have long been misunderstood and misrepresented. Yet, despite the myths and stereotypes, this era laid essential foundations for our modern world. Understanding these myths and their roots reveals much about both the past and the present. Why do medieval myths persist? The stories of knights in shining armor, dragons, witches, and shadowy inquisitions have a powerful hold on our imaginations. These myths endure because they deal with fundamental human themes: good versus evil, heroism, fear, and the unknown. They offer simple, dramatic narratives that explain complex ideas and satisfy our need for stories. We are drawn to tales of adventure and moral struggle, and the medieval setting offers a perfect backdrop. Popular culture, movies, books, video games, and TV shows plays a huge role in sustaining these images. From Game of Thrones to the Lord of the Rings adaptations, the medieval world is reimagined as a land of magic, brutal conflicts, and larger-than-life characters. While these stories capture attention and inspire creativity, they often blur the lines between fact and fiction, reinforcing certain myths about the period. Historical shaping of myths. It's important to remember that some of the myths about the Middle Ages were actively created or exaggerated by later generations. Renaissance thinkers, for example, sought to distinguish their era as a rebirth of classical knowledge and culture, contrasting themselves with a supposedly ignorant and stagnant medieval period. This led to the idea of the Dark Ages as a time of intellectual darkness, a narrative that has persisted in popular understanding despite being largely inaccurate. Similarly, nationalistic movements in the 19th and 20th centuries used medieval imagery and myths to construct identities and ideals. Castles, knights, and chivalry became symbols of heritage and pride, often divorced from historical reality. These mythologized images helped unite people but sometimes oversimplified and romanticized a complex era. Real medieval achievements and legacies. Beyond myths, the Middle Ages contributed significantly to the development of Western civilization. The foundations of modern universities were laid during this period, with institutions like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford fostering scholarship and debate. Many classical texts were preserved, studied, and expanded upon by medieval scholars. Legal systems also evolved, with concepts such as trial by jury, habeas corpus, and legal representation tracing roots to medieval practice. The Magna Carta of 1215, often seen as a cornerstone of modern democracy, originated in this era. Architecturally, the Gothic cathedrals that still awe visitors today symbolize medieval innovation in engineering and artistic expression. These structures were not only places of worship but also centers of community life and pride. The Middle Ages were also a period of cultural exchange, with trade routes connecting Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This facilitated the flow of goods, ideas, technologies, and even foods, shaping a more interconnected world. The importance of nuance and understanding. Appreciating the Middle Ages requires moving beyond simple caricatures. It was neither a uniform Dark Age nor a perfect paradise. It was a dynamic, evolving era marked by struggles and achievements, ignorance and enlightenment, brutality and beauty. Medieval myths remind us how history can be shaped by perspective, power, and storytelling. They challenge us to look deeper, question assumptions, and embrace complexity. By understanding this period more fully, we gain insight not only into the past but into how we construct narratives about history and identity today. Why it matters today. The myths of the Middle Ages continue to influence how we see our world. They shape literature, film, and art. They inform political symbolism and cultural identity. At the same time, Reevaluating these myths opens space for greater empathy and knowledge. It helps combat stereotypes and promotes critical thinking. The Middle Ages teach us about resilience and transformation, how societies adapt and grow through conflict and change. They remind us that every era has light and shadow, and that understanding both is key to understanding humanity.